First of all, a couple of things that I need to say ahead of time. When I mention the book, actually there are 2 or 3 books I could be talking about. I took a number of things from Journey in Faith, which some of you are aware of, for this morning, for the first half of this morning anyway. So I could be referring to that. Second of all, I could be referring to the book that Karen's committee has told us to make about the history of Madison Avenue Christian Church. I'm writing the text, Alicia is compiling that. And just to keep you around in case it's boring this morning, hopefully the last 5 minutes today will give you a sneak preview of approximately 40% of that book has been written now and compiled by Alicia, so we're getting very excited about that. So that's one of the things I could be referring to. Second of all, I need to mention a couple of things. I'm a teacher, some of you know that, and in order to learn something, you don't just jump in. You have to have the foundation, going all the way back to preschool. And I recall when Claudia wrote her histories of the church, starting in 1953, or maybe even before that, and then every time we had some sort of an anniversary, she would mention that to understand the history of Madison Avenue Church, you really needed to go back to 1874, when the predecessor church was formed. And I've taken that a little bit farther. To me, in order to understand the church, and we're not talking about the history of the building, I'm sure Christopher will toss in a few things from time to time, or different things like that. We're talking about the people, and we're talking about the issues that formed us and made this church into what it is today. So in order to do that, you need to go back to at least 1827, when our predecessor church, one of our predecessor churches, was formed. And in order to understand the tremendously turbulent time of the 1820s, you need to go back a little bit before that. So I've already apologized to Debbie, who said last week or the week before, as a seminary person, she really doesn't need to hear about Barton Stone and Alexander Campbell again. We're going to start talking about them because I think you need to understand that. And to Wayne, who gave us 2 or 3 weeks of work on Barton Stone a few weeks ago, and I missed one of them, unfortunately, so I don't know what he said, so I'm going to have to repeat. But I'll try to go pretty quickly through it. If we ever do a Disciples of Christ series, which I've done before, we can get into some of these a little bit more so than we do this morning. So I hope be kind of fast, but just a reminder, it's been almost 6 months, 5 months, I guess, since you did those weeks for us.
Hey.
I will ask, this is not intended, in future weeks, we'll try to do this at the end of each month, so you know which week it will be. There are not a lot of videos from the 1800s, and that's what we're going to be talking about this morning. There are not a lot of recordings. There are not even a lot of pictures at the beginning. So yes, we will be using a lot of technology at the beginning, but some of that will have to wait just a little bit. The other thing I want to mention is that I hope as we get more into Madison Avenue Christian Church, we can do much more discussion. It's really intended to be more discussion. But as I put this out yesterday, and I asked for some spiritual guidance, to be honest with you, this is what came up. And so I will encourage you, if you have questions, please ask, because it will allow me to spread this out, and then maybe I can do less preparation for next time. Second of all, I think that's where it can really be interesting. So if you just want me to go slower, if you want to question something that's on here, please do. If you want to bring up something, that's also very appropriate. And I will certainly ask Reverend Barnett anytime, don't feel like you're contradicting what I'm saying, because either I may have said it wrong or I may be a little bit wrong and I want to learn as well. So, and that goes for anybody. Debbie, of course, has heard much of this before. So, with that, I will start with this slide. It's going back to 1626. It's going to take a long time. To me, there are several little phrases that when you think of the Disciples of Christ Church, the Christian Church Disciples of Christ, you think of. And this is probably my favorite, probably the one that has been least messed up, is the word I'm trying to pick up. In essentials, unity. And by the way, this was done by somebody called Meldenius, a German Lutheran back in 1626. If you'd asked me that yesterday, I wouldn't have known who it was, and I still don't know. In essentials, unity. We are together. In non-essentials, liberty, freedom to think, to interpret the way we want. In all things, charity. My favorite part is actually, well, of course, the first sentence, but especially this last one. And I think that's where the Disciples of Christ Church and Christian churches, or Protestant churches in general, have lost their way. In all things, charity. And to me, I would think my interpretation of Jesus is that that's how he would be. So that has been quoted many times in regards to our church. Certainly the Disciples of Christ is one of the largest religions founded in America. We don't claim to be one of the largest religions, but or denominations. I shouldn't use the word denomination when the next thing is going to be Barton Stone, Alexander Campbell, Thomas Campbell, and Walter Scott. Those are our founders. Go back to the, or maybe up to, from 16-something or other, up to the mid-1700s. We know that religion was important to the early settlers because of the fact that they came from Europe for religious freedom. So obviously it was important. However, according to some books anyway, by the third or fourth generation that they were over here, it was less so. There was not a lot of organized religion, at least not on the frontier. The Disciples of Christ Church is certainly something that was born on the frontier. 1740, there was the Great Awakening. The only reason I mentioned the Great Awakening is because our church came out of the Second Great Awakening in the early 1800s. So I mentioned Jonathan Edwards, George Whitefield. Certainly we spend a lot of time talking about them. Not too surprisingly, after the Great Awakening, there was another decline in organized religion in the Revolutionary War. Kind of more concerned about the war happening on our soil than getting to church every week and so on. According to the book that I read, not more than 5 to 10% were actually affiliated with a church. That doesn't mean they weren't religious. They had their Bibles and so on. But as far as going to a church, you can imagine you got a cabin here, and then 12 miles down the road you got another cabin, so you're not going to have an awful lot of people there. Good morning. I won't get into these things right now. I took 5 or 6 of these slides from something that I did previously, so those are some other influences that we could talk about at another time. This slide also is pretty much like that. I wanted to mention the Great Awakening when I went back yesterday. So Jonathan Edwards, congregational minister in Massachusetts, some consider him the greatest American theologian, and so on. All right. Moving up to late 1700s, the Methodists in 1783 were still part of the Church of England. Looked that back up again last night because that's exactly the way it was listed in Journey of Faith. But they kind of broke off, in effect. Wesley arranged for Asbury to become the bishop, and then they were on their own. There really was not that much connection with Europe. The Episcopal Church, the church of the English royal officials, was most damaged in that period of time because all the British officials were members of that church, and pretty obvious, I guess. The Presbyterians that we came out of, more so than anything else, were well fitted to grow. There were 2 presbyteries in Kentucky by 1781. Another one soon to, didn't last very long, but another one soon to come about. These others, more so came with later immigrations. There were certainly some here. The Congregationalists resisted centralizing and slow growth. I think it was the Congregationalists that ended up joining with some others and ended up being the UCC. Okay. Later on. So they have an interesting connection with us, but the Baptists were also strong and positioned for growth. Again, if you have any questions at any time, just yell out and we'll do some more interesting things than what's up here. Certainly because these were the pioneers on the frontier, these are some of the things that were important to people. Freedom to interpret the scriptures. Did you need a bishop to do that? Did you need a pope? Did you need whatever? Tremendous opposition to creeds. I would put this in every time I can because I'm a big opposition to creed person myself. Opposition even to denominational names, and therefore you saw a lot of use of terms like Christian, Church of Christ, Church of God, disciples of Christ. It doesn't have to be capitalized, it's just a descriptive term. So these are some of the things that some people are talking about. Barton Stone. I resurrected Mr. Stone, or at least his picture. This picture, we are in the Barton W. Stone room. And one of the things I want to find out is when this room started to be called the Barton W. Stone room, because it was not called that from the first time that it was opened. And that picture, it seems like, was it right there? Or no, I think it was over here, it seems like, for many, many years, because this was what's called the Barton Stone class, wasn't it? Yeah. So anyway, certainly one of the two most important founders, should be reviewed for most of you, but if in case it's not, there's a period of time that he lived. Barton W. Stone was a Presbyterian minister. He served two small churches. I'm sure that you got a lot of this for those of you who went to, real quick, how many people went on the trip to Cambridge a few weeks ago? Okay. Most of you, unfortunately I missed it. Concord and Cane Ridge, pretty typical at that time. Still today in some places.
I have a question. Where's Concord?
Fairly close to...
Because when I grew up, there was a Concord in Hamilton County, but I'm sure that's not it.
I don't think so. I think it's closer to Cambridge.
I was thinking it's closer.
I've never really heard Concord in terms of disciples.
Because back in the late 1700s, early 1800s, the cars went very slowly at that time. So they... Anyway, Barton Stone had a kind of conflicted ministry, very interesting, and we can do this at another period of time if you want to do a real careful look at the disciples of Christ instead of the 25-minute one. But he went to a law college as opposed to Yale or Harvard or William & Mary or something like that. A law college kind of aimed toward becoming a minister. But he was bothered by certain things in the Presbyterian faith. The required acceptance of creeds bothered him tremendously. Interesting, when he came to be licensed, certified, whatever you go through. He went before a panel, and they said, I get the wrong creed, but he said, do you agree with the Westminster, thank you, Westminster Confession? And he apparently said something like, I agree with it as far as I believe it to be consistent with
the New Testament.
The New Testament. And I'm guessing now that the people on the panel kind of rolled their eyes and looked at each other and said, okay, I guess that's okay. So they let him through. But he definitely had some big problems with that. In his churches, in 1801, the key year, he was 29 years old. Interesting that age comes up a few other times in our history. He was 29 years old, concerned by the lack of vitality in his churches. This was about the time on the frontier that the Second Great Awakening was about to happen, not just the frontier, but in America. And he attended a camp meeting, and as a result of this, He helped to organize the Cane Ridge camp meeting in August 1801. And it's very quick, and I'm sure that you got a lot more if you went down to Cane Ridge. Okay. But anyway, August 1801. Just for review for those people who were not there, and here is, that original slide, by the way, had an actual photograph. I think this is a painting of the log of the Cane Ridge meeting house without the stone structure around it. So I can still remember back in 1830 going to visit that thing. Maybe that's in my mind. But I'm an anachronism. Never used that word before, but I want to toss it. Anyway, here's an artist's rendition. This is by both of these are, but this one I had not seen before at the Historical Christian Disciples of Christ Historical Society, which I want to become my second home down in Nashville. Very, very emotional. Possibly as many as 20,000. I've seen estimates anywhere from 10,000 to 30,000 people who just came from all over. And not, Disciples of Christ didn't exist at that point. Presbyterians, Methodists, Baptists, all were involved. And you had apparently people all over the grounds as you looked out to the fields, to the right and behind the cabin there, the church. Anywhere you had a tree stump, you had a minister, Methodist, Presbyterian, Baptist, up on the stump giving a sermon, or non-denominational, just anybody could grab a stump, I guess, and preaching. You had people strutting around like chickens, and you had people falling on the ground, overcome by the Holy Spirit, and fainting, and speaking in tongues, and very, very emotional. I don't think it's a type of setting that I would have been very comfortable, to be very honest with you. But interesting in going through this, I had it's next time. But 1874, when we broke off, I got an insight last night that I want to share with you next time. So anyway, Cane Ridge, what came out? Well, 5 people, 5 ministers. Remember, Stone was Presbyterian. Withdrew from the Presbyterian Synod of Kentucky and formed the independent Springfield Presbyterian. In other words, they got in trouble for possibly some of the emotionalism. Once again, we could talk lots and lots about this, but I'm just trying to kind of rush through it. That was in 1803, and they formed their independent organization. Well, these people weren't big on organizations, and they weren't big on denominations. And after a period of time, they felt like, wait, we've just started a new church, and that's not what we were trying to do. And they published one of the most fascinating documents that I can imagine, the last will and testimony of the Springfield Presbytery. Basically, and they said, we're dissolving. We're going to go out of business, because they felt like it was just becoming another sectarian movement. In that fascinating document, almost bulleted items in there, but they claim the Bible as their only guide. We need to pray more and dispute less. Each church should be free to choose and license their own ministers. You can see why they got kicked out of the Presbyterians. They wanted their name to be forgotten. Even such terms as, and if you read some of these documents very carefully, you'll find some things that have filtered into Simon as well. I don't think he's comfortable with the term reverend and different things like that. So as you look at these things throughout, you'll see them coming on. They simply called themselves Christians. And by 1830, there were about 12,000. It was fairly slowly growing movement, if you want to call it that. Many people dismiss this as, there's definitely some sarcasm in it, and some wit in it. And some people said, it's just a silly joke that they're trying, but it's amazing, I believe. So if you get a chance, or if we ever do something on just the disciples of Christ, it's something that we can read and look at and fascinate. All right, across the ocean, totally apart from this, Thomas Campbell was a Scottish-Irish Presbyterian minister. Guess what? He was concerned that all sorts of fighting. If you thought there was fighting in America, not really, because they were just out on the frontier, but tremendous fighting with the various divisions and so on. Concerned about religious strife caused by sectarian divisions and creeds. I won't even try to remember. Let's see, the Presbyterians, there was the seceder and the they broke into the seceder and the non-seceder. And then one or both of them, there were the burghers and the anti-burghers. And you had all these different ones, and they all, I guess, hated each other because, they find one little thing that this one didn't agree with. And if you're doing creeds, everybody has to believe exactly the same thing on everything. Then you got this big problem. So, to kind of get away from that, he came to America in 1807 and settled in Pennsylvania. There are lots of reasons for that, but he did by himself with the idea that possibly his family would follow. And guess what? He was soon in trouble over here with the church because one day he was giving communion, and I don't know if he was a seceder branch or a non-seceder branch, but somebody from the other branch came in. He let them take communion. Can you imagine letting somebody from not exactly that one branch of the church? So he got in big trouble. Somebody reported it, and so he had been pretty well kicked out of the Presbyterians by this point. And he published what's called the Declaration and Address. I have not read this, but I want to at some point. But this outlined his ideas. Spelled out the principles of the Christian Association. Some of the other ministers who had either been kicked out or dropped out, whatever, had joined this. It discusses the essential unity of all branches of Christianity, that the Bible is sole authority, and the divisiveness of human creeds. So you have these two different movements going on. Alexander Campbell. Did I have a picture? Okay. Alexander Campbell is the son. Now, I actually found a picture of him in his 20s, much younger. But this is one that is more what we think of as Alexander Campbell. In 1809, as a 21-year-old, flashing back to that age, his family, Thomas had said, okay, come on over and join me. I think we're ready to do this in America. So they, very fascinating journey that it took. I think well over a year in getting from Ireland to America. But they joined each other. There's I don't know how many of you have seen the movie, what's the movie called? About Alexander Campbell, the beginnings. We've shown it right here in this class. 2 or 3 years ago. There's actually a movie made with actual actors and actresses that you would recognize. But I can recall that scene where they met up coming across the prairie. But to their amazement, and maybe it's not too surprising, but they found out that Alexander and his father Thomas had very much the same ideas. Somehow, in the intervening 2 years, he had broken with the Presbyterian Church over issues of open communion. And if there are possibly, 3 images in my mind that would make good scenes in a movie about the starting of the Disciples of Christ Church, one would be where Alexander Campbell, as at that point probably a 19 or 20-year-old, walked to the front to had received his token or whatever, saying that he was allowed to take communion at that church. And he went up to the front and he stood there and was very, very tormented and threw down the token, whatever that was,
It's
and
like this ticket
walked out of the church.
to
Yeah.
take communion. You
Right.
were like identified, and he was angry and threw it. And,
So, fascinating. That's what had happened, and because of that, he had broken with the church. So, lots more to the story. Thomas had him, do lots of study and so on, but he joined his father as part of this. And by 1815, he had become basically the dynamic leader. He was a tremendously dynamic leader of the disciples movement.
Was that movie called Wrestling with God?
Yes.
That's it.
Very good. Do little files in the computer.
1990.
1990. We got that. So. Anyway, so talk about a little bit about Alexander Campbell. Now we're moving close to the 20s here, as you can see, and that's our goal, and then we can start the MACC history. By 1816, there was very little progress, mainly Thomas and Alexander preaching around at various churches. 1818, Alexander opened a seminary at Bethany. He was very connected with that area, which is actually in West Virginia now. It was Virginia at that time.
Just outside of Wheeling.
At Wheeling. And
Just
I've got
outside
to
of
visit
Wheeling. I've been there.
I've got to visit there someday. I so much look forward to that. But anyway, it closed, but it did open again. So Bethany College, I guess it's still there today.
Yes.
So anyway, very, very important. Has a connection to our church later on. That's why we're going through all these things. A little bit reluctant to do any debating. Remember, they didn't have television and radio and everything back then. Church and debates and different things like this and revivals were really, really big stuff. They didn't have Dancing with the Stars to watch on Monday and Tuesday nights. Anyway, he was talked into doing a debate regarding baptism, and I didn't go through, I just mentioned them. Another debate in 1823 near Maysville, where apparently he came in contact with the Stone movement. So he actually met Barton Stone, I think, possibly here. 1829, the most famous debate with Robert Owen, fairly big historical name. It took place in Cincinnati. And by the way, Cincinnati, Maysville, and Lexington, those are three huge hubs, aren't they, of the history of the disciples of Christ Church. So we're right in this, in Covington, of course, basically greater Cincinnati. But this is a tremendously famous debate, and these things would go on for 7 hours, days with these things. That's depicted in the movie as well. 1837, an 8-day debate with, that's where I got it, with the Catholic Archbishop of Cincinnati, and one in Lexington. In the book, I mentioned that Alexander Campbell was really kind of a superstar in the 1800s. Who moderated the debate? Henry Clay. This was the Presbyterians versus the Reformers, and often his disciples' movement was called the Reformers, although by 1843 I don't know that that term was used as much. But anyway, this was big hello on him. But he was really kind of a superstar, and Simon likes to remind us that when the Virginia Constitution was being rewritten in the obviously the 1800s, that he was chosen as a delegate to that, and there he came in contact with Jefferson or Madison, Monroe, some people like that, and they actually have quotes about him. Is it Madison or Monroe who said that he was the greatest expounder of New Testament or something that he had ever witnessed, something to that extent. So, big stuff. One more person. We mentioned Barton Stone, we mentioned Alexander Campbell, we mentioned Thomas Campbell, the father, who continued, of course, to be tremendously important, but took a minor role. He actually came up to Boone County and was going to take a job at Boone County, except there was some sort of law that you couldn't teach blacks in the same group, and so he said, it's not for me. So anyway, Walter Scott came to America from Scotland in 1818, joined the Primitive Christian Church, met Alexander Campbell. Scott became kind of the evangelist for the new movement. He had a job actually, and he got 2,000 new converts, whatever, members in some of his revivals or whatever. He actually served congregations in Cincinnati, Pittsburgh, Maysville, and Covington. First Christian claims that he was a minister there. I have gotten information that he served a church in Covington, that was the only church. I have not been able to verify when it was. And I actually think that in the 1800s, I think it might have been sometimes, just a little bit more like the Sunday school class that often meets in this room. And that is, we don't have a teacher. We just say, okay, we want to stay next week. So I am 99% sure that he preached at First Christian, what we call First Christian Church. Whether or not he was the minister for a certain amount of time, I can't tell you. I have not tried to get into their records, but so far they haven't given me that option. Anyway, one thing is for sure, from 1852 to 1855, he was head of the Women's Institute or something like that, a school for girls in Covington. I don't know where that was located. Fascinating. He's well known for the five-finger approach to becoming a Christian. You need faith, repentance of sins, baptism, remission, and then you are freed of your sins and the gift of the Holy Spirit. That's all you need, so you don't need other things in order to do that. There are many people who say that were it not for Walter Scott, our denomination would never have made it. Because you got Alexander Campbell, who was Alexander Campbell, you got Barton Stone, who was this minister, this farmer minister, and so on. And they were so slowly building anything until Walter Scott got involved. All right, so they're close to coming together, and we can get to Stone's Christians were growing slowly by the 1820s. Huge decade there. In this period of time, the reformers, Campbell's group, the disciples, had a loose and uneasy connection with the Baptists. They both believed in baptism by immersion. And because of that, and because Campbell's movement felt like, we should all be together, they formed this alliance. But if you knew Alexander Campbell as well as I do, if you knew Alexander Campbell, he couldn't be, I'll let you put it together. He was constantly trying to change. We've had a few people come into this church through the years, and they say, you know what, they're not exactly right. And have tried to change us, to be honest with you. And I can imagine that. So, at the best of intentions, I'm sure, but it didn't work out. And so he just kept trying to change, and his journal agitated constantly for reform. Journals were really big back then. Both Stone and Campbell had one. Let's see. Interesting. Campbell in 1826 predicted that, we'll have lots of trouble with the Baptists, but I believe that by 1900, historians will look back and say that the Baptists were the only group that would have accepted those darn reformers. Well, they didn't either. By 1830, they had been excluded, been eliminated from the Baptist churches. And many of the Baptist churches in Kentucky, and I think Wayne can say a lot more about this, but many of the Baptist churches in Kentucky split in the 1820s with the reformers, came the disciples, Campbell's group, and back to the normal Baptists. His goal was to return the church, quote, from Babylon back to Jerusalem, to take it back to the primitive church and get rid of all these other things, popes and everything like that. Real quickly, we spent a lot more time on this, but differences between the Baptists and Reformers as they split. So we did have a period of time when we were with the Baptists. Disciples were more interested in restoring primitive Christianity. Some Baptist churches used the Philadelphia Confession based on. Baptists actually had associations. We didn't like that idea. We got them now, but didn't like that. They regarded the name Baptist as sectarian, and we shouldn't use that. Baptists had communion quarterly, and the disciples wanted it weekly. The Reformers, all you had to do was confess your faith and be baptized. The Baptists felt like you had to have personal experience. The congregation had to vote if they were going to accept you, and so on. The Baptists only ordained ministers to administer baptism. What do? Debbie administers, Pam administers it, Karen administers it, and the deacons do it, not the minister. Interesting. Emphasized the authority of the New Testament, and of course by 1830 it was pretty well split. Fascinating stuff. All right, so these two movements by Stone and Campbell coming together. Met Stone, they never became close friends. I'm not going to say they hated each other, but
They probably didn't have enough in common, with one being a farmer and the other one being a farmer.
Exactly. Campbell was this wealthy gentleman farmer. He had received the farm from his wife's family, so he would stay up in Bethany. Stone always struggled financially. He would plan his sermons as he was plowing his fields throughout much of his life. Campbell was educated at the University of Glasgow, Stone in a law college. Campbell was more articulate, refined, dominant. Stone was warmer and gentler. And this was the insight that I had last night. I don't know if it's true or not, but I think I got more of a feel for why the two churches down the road here split in 1874. You can just let that percolate until next time. They did have a lot in common, the two disciples and Christians now. Both advocated a return to biblical church. Both advocated the unity of the church. Both would have agreed with this, I believe. Both rejected creeds. They recognized only two ordinances, the baptism and the Lord's Supper. Both believed in baptism by immersion, but one was a little bit more strict about it than the other. They both opposed sectarian and unscriptural names. They wanted to send us back. And if you go through a history of the Christianity through the Middle Ages and so on, there are just so many ridiculous things that got added on that Jesus would have just shook his head. There were, however, some differences, and if we want to take a minute or two, you might want to think about which you would have been more in tune with, the disciples of Alexander Campbell or the Christians of Barton Dunn Stone. Primitive Christianity versus unity. The disciples of Alexander Campbell lean more toward restoring early Christianity first. Barton Stone's group said, let's all come together first. We want to restore the original faith, but most important thing is unity. Disciples were more hardcore immersionists. You had to be immersed. And the Christians said, it's probably the best way, but if the creek's running low, don't worry too much about it. Disciples, Lord's Supper weekly, Christians less frequently, not that important to be every week. Disciples were more anti-clerical. The Christians were more accepting of emotionalism, the Barton Stone group. And the disciples were more rational. I'm slightly leaning toward the Christians, except on this one. I'm definitely more rational. I'm definitely bothered by the emotionalism. But think about where you are on each one of those. The name, of course, was a constant problem. If it were not for Alexander Campbell, he was the holdout. The others, his father, Stone and Scott, said, let's just call ourselves Christians. And most of the churches today are called Madison Avenue Christian Church. But he held out for disciples. He's very, very bullheaded and adamant about that. So what did we do? We call ourselves the Christian Church Disciples of Christ in parentheses. The problems around there. So did you figure out which one you're more in tune with? Any comments there? Where they actually came together. So help me, Wayne.
They met in Lexington in 1832.
Exactly. And first of all, and that was on January 1st, I think, 1832. They started, okay, as the Baptists and the Christians were dividing all these churches, they came to realize that there were two movements here, one by Stone, one by Campbell. And there were a couple of churches that were first, and I forgot their names, in Kentucky, I believe, that said, hey, you know, small town, we got two different churches, we believe the same thing, and we believe in unity, let's go together. And so they would combine. This happened in Georgetown. Two churches came together. And so then they decided to have a conference there in Georgetown in 1831 to see about unifying the two movements. And it happened. As Wayne said, on January 1st, 1831 at Hill Street Christian Church in Lexington.
32.
32. January 1st, they met, and the second big important thing from the disciples of Christ happened. They shook hands. Raccoon John Smith, representing Alexander Campbell, who was not there, and Stone shook hands to cement the deal, combining those two. And so we were now one church. Still didn't have a name, but anyway. So that's the one that is missing, the unity one. I'll put that in the next one. Raccoon John Smith, representing the disciples. I have a picture of his on, how did I not get that? Just put that on last night. And John Rogers. And I have a reason for mentioning all these, because they all tie into our church. So they actually rode out together around the country, around the region, and so on, encouraging unification of the churches. One of the last places that it occurred, I believe, was Lexington. I've heard that was really interesting. But of course, this was Alexander Campbell's journal. This was Barton Stone's journal. And the reports of the effort. New converts helped, and it grew. There were like 10,000 disciples and 12,000 Christians, something like that, approximately. Oh, there's what it says. Some Christians never merged. They later united with the Congregationalists and eventually formed the UCC, which we now again have some sort of a loose connection with. And some other information there. Okay. So we finally get to Madison Avenue Christian Church, or at least the Christian Church in Covington. This is where I want to make sure I got to today. The 1820s. Covington founded in 1850. 15, population 750, wasn't real big. James G. Arnold, Covington businessman, organized a church of about 12 to 15 people, which met on 2nd Street. They have good records of this, that church does. This is basically First Christian Church called today. Met in a small room of a building, 13 by 15 feet. Didn't need all that space for 12 to 15 people, except when Alexander Campbell came to speak there around 1830. They have records that indicate that Raccoon John Smith also visited around this time. Unfortunately, that church was one, and that is, there's the Raccoon John Smith. Unfortunately, this church was wiped out by the cholera epidemic of 1833. Check that in your history.
So did James Arnold die?
No, he was not wiped out.
Okay.
No. He lived to fight another day. Founder of the Christian Church in Covington. I call it that because it wasn't called the First Christian Church then. It was the only Christian church. He successfully restarted the church in 1840, paid for a church to be built on 3rd Street, not the one that's there now. This was their first minister. I mentioned their second minister. There must be a reason for that. There's his picture, Dr. James Challen. Just remember that. They claim that Walter Scott was a minister of that church. And here's the last slide for today. In 1865, the Covington population had grown quite a bit. He helped arrange, he didn't totally pay for the church. The current church lot, not the current church, but on the current lot. It was incorporated with Kentucky in 1865. Isaac Errett was the editor of the Christian Standard, tremendously important in the second generation of disciples, ministers, and preached the dedicatory sermon. There he is. And other ministers, P.B. Wiles, remember that name, Barbie Collins, Rogers, not the Rogers who went out with Raccoon John Smith, but the nephew of that person in 1874. So that is the end of this. For anybody who wants to stick around, we'll do this again, taking it from 1874. Fascinating. Come on back. At the last week of next month. And of course, as we get farther into it, we'll have videos and pictures and all sorts of other things.